It is Easter. It's the time of year where we don't just talk about Jesus, but we celebrate something very unique. And before we dive in, I want to read the Easter story. After the Sabbath, at dawn, on the first day of the week, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to look at the tomb. There was a violent earthquake, for an angel of the Lord had come down from heaven and, going to the tomb, rolled back the stone and sat on it. His appearance was like lightning, and his clothes were white as snow. The guards were so afraid of him, and they shook and became like dead men. The angel said to the woman, "Do not be afraid, for I know that you are looking for Jesus who is crucified. He is not here. He has risen just as he said. Come and see the place where he lay. Then go quickly and tell his disciples, he has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you into Galilee. There you will see him. Now I have told you." So the women hurried away from the tomb, afraid yet filled with joy, and ran to tell his disciples. Suddenly Jesus met them. "Greetings," he said. They came to him, clasped his feet, and worshiped him. Then Jesus said to them, "Do not be afraid. Go and tell my brothers, go to Galilee. There they will see me." When Janine and I, that's my wife's name, she was just up here a moment ago, when we first got married, we wanted to have kids right away. It had always been a desire of ours, arguably. We started talking about having kids way too early, okay? And so we really wanted to have kids. We wanted to have a young family. And so once we got married, we had our first child. Now, we had a lot of expectations about what this would be like. I think I've said it before, but I was a way better parent before I had kids than after I had kids. Okay, there's like a lot of plans that we made. We're going to do this. We're going to have this schedule. We're going to do these things. And then you have a kid, and like for all the right reasons, that stuff just melts away. Right? And I remember holding Asa, and holding all of my kids. We got to hold all of our kids like right away. And I remember holding Asa, our oldest, and though each one was special, holding him was just an incredibly unique experience. It was like that first time, it was life-changing. It was a moment in time where nothing else would ever be the same. And although he doesn't like it, he's 14 years old, he's taller than I am, and I still try to do that. Like, I still try to just... You're going to be all right, buddy. Everything's going to be fine. And his voice is getting deep. He's like, "Dad." But I remember when I held him for the first time, and I knew instantly, like, everything was going to change. Everything was going to be different. And it was. We had to change how we structured everything. There was sacrifice. We couldn't just do the things we wanted to do. It changed some things that we weren't anticipating. Like, friends would call up and be like, "Hey, let's go hang out tonight." We're like, "Hey, we have kid. Like, we got kid. I can't. We can't do that right now." And, friends didn't understand. And we had just had to change everything. We're like, "Well, we're going to just go everywhere and do everything. It doesn't matter. We'll just bring the kid along." And now I look back at that and I'm like, I laugh at that because the kid, they change everything. It's a unique moment in time where it changes the trajectory and the course of events after that. Now, maybe it's not the birth of a child, maybe it's something else. It could be even relatively small, but it might be on a massive scale. All of us have a life that's actually been filled with at least one, but probably multiple significant events that really change the course of our lives. Now, some of those are really, really positive ones, like having a kid. You guys had kids. That's twins. Okay, that's how it works. Having a child, it could be really positive like that. It might also be something incredibly negative. It could be something as minimal as losing a job when you weren't anticipating losing a job, right? That changes things. It might be the loss of a loved one. It might be betrayal or hurt in a relationship. It might be all sorts of things. But these are moments that actually have incredible power to define a life going forward. Now, I've gotten to ask the question to a number of people, in light of some of those harmful or negative events, like if you could go back and change it, would you? And I'm always a little bit surprised. Most of the time it's a no. Most of the time it's no, and the reason is because I am who I am in light of that event. Now, I get that sentiment, and I think I would agree with that sentiment, at least in terms of the negative experiences that I've had in my own life. Hurt and betrayal in relationship probably among some of the most harmful. Would I change those? No. I don't think I would. But I do wish something, and I think maybe there's a collective agreement here. I think we would maybe not change the thing, because it has made us who we are, but I think there's elements of that thing that we wish we could be free of. When I've been hurt and betrayed, I understand that I'm going to grow as a person in light of that, but there are times where I really wish I could trust. Trust came a lot harder. And so whatever that event is, I think there's probably an element of that in all of us where we think, I don't want to lose that. I wouldn't go back and change it because I am who I am because of that thing. However, I wish I could be free of it in this sense. I wish that there was something that could happen that would change how I live in light of that event. All of us live in light of our past events. All of us live in light of our hurts and our traumas, the good things that we celebrate and the bad things that hurt. We all live in light of those things. It's an event that changes us. But what if there was another event that was more powerful, that could remove the sting of those events? What if that was available to us? Would we want it? I'm going to be reading from 1 Corinthians chapter 15. It's going to be on the screen if you want to follow along. If you brought a Bible with you, you can open up to 1 Corinthians chapter 15. Maybe you want to open it up on the Bible app on your phone or download that, snag it really quick and open it up. You can follow along there. There's a number of ways you can follow along. And now, we already read the story of the resurrection, and I just got to be honest. I know there's going to be a room full of people here, and we're probably all on different pages. Some of us have believed this story for a long time. Some of us were coaxed and coerced into coming here by friends and family. Wherever you are on that spectrum, you're okay to be where you are this morning. Okay, you're okay to be in the state that you are. You're okay to disagree with me. Because when we come to talk about this, every time I read about the resurrection, I just got to be honest with you. I'm like, do we really believe this? Yeah, we do. Okay? Is it unbelievable? Yeah, it is. Right? This is the claim that somebody was dead and came back to life. That's a big claim. So I understand if you're having trouble getting there intellectually. It's not like a really scientific thing, is it? But we profess boldly, I profess boldly, this is what I believe. And since I'm the one on the stage, I get to talk. So I want to read 1 Corinthians 15, and we're going to read the first 8 verses, okay? Now, brothers and sisters, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you, which you received, and on which you have taken your stand. By this gospel you are saved, if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Otherwise, you have believed in vain. For what I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins, according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day, according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then the 12. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. And then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me also as to one abnormally born. Now, this is a letter. It's not just a book of the Bible. It's a letter that was written to a group of believers in the city of Corinth. It was a Roman city filled with Roman citizens, a few Jewish citizens. Up to this point, most of the followers of Jesus had been Jewish. Now, Paul is a guy who is a follower of Jesus, and he is writing this letter. He helped start the church that's in Corinth. He helped bring those believers to faith, organize them, and when he left, there was a church there. And now he's not there anymore, but he's writing back to them. And he wants to remind them about a few things. He wants to remind them about a few incredibly important things that, if they will hold on to them and remember them, will change the trajectory of their lives forever. We talk about those moments that define and change us. The resurrection, we believe in the church, is one of the most significant and the most powerful events we experience. It has the power to change all other events, or at the very least, redefine them. That's what Paul wants to write about. As he writes in verse 1, he says, "Now, brothers and sisters," that's the group of believers, "I want to remind you of the gospel I preached to you." Gospel is a weird word. It's kind of gotten really churchy, but actually when Paul was writing, it was just starting its kind of spiritual usage, because up till that point in time, gospel was not a spiritual word at all. In fact, one of the most common usages of the word was when there was a transition of power for governing authorities, or particularly kings. And so if a king was murdered or died in battle or just died in general, there was going to be a transition of power, and it was a very vulnerable time for a kingdom. There was a time where uprisings could happen. The power structures were very vulnerable. And so people in general, all across the land, all across the kingdom, all across the governed area, would actually feel the tension of what's going to happen. It was unstable for all of them, because whatever happened, they could be collateral damage in the process. And at some point, the transition of power would end, and a new king would ascend on the throne, and he would send out heralds who would proclaim the gospel. And what the gospel was, it's our one single word that we kind of transliterate from the original language that really just means good news. And most of the time it was, there's good news. There's a new king on the throne. Don't worry, nothing bad's going to happen anymore, unless, of course, that king's bad. Then you should probably still worry. The gospel is essentially, it's not really a spiritual word. It's a good news word. That's all that it is. It represents good news. And so Paul is writing back, and he says, listen, brothers and sisters, he's writing predominantly to people who have already professed their trust in Jesus. And he says, I want to remind you of something, and it's really about this gospel, this good news that I preached to you. And it's a good news that he's going to give a really shorthand summary of in just a moment. But that gospel, that good news, essentially is just about Jesus. It's about this person of Jesus. There's been a lot of reports flying around about a Jewish guy who tried to lead an insurrection against Rome, and he was crucified in one of the most brutal forms of punishment that the kingdom of Rome, the empire of Rome, could conceive of. So he was crucified. But there's this weird group of people that is claiming that he's not dead anymore. Now, the Jewish religious leaders, this guy that was murdered, he was a Jew, but he claimed to be their king, and the religious leaders are like, no, that's not us. He's not our king. In fact, his disciples came along and stole his body after he was killed. He had talked about rising from the dead again, and so they were like, well, we gotta see this story through. We're in this deep. Might as well not waste the time we've already spent with him. Let's get the body out. So that was what the Jewish leaders kind of propagated, and it's what we have one account of Jesus' biography records that there was even money paid to Roman authorities to propagate this lie. But there's this other group of people that are believing this outlandish reality that he's not dead anymore, that he's actually physically alive. Can you imagine that? The audacity to claim that somebody is dead but is alive again. And not just like in some ghost or spiritual form, but like he was actually flesh and blood again. How crazy is that? Well, that's the good news that Paul wants to talk about. And he's going to define it in just a moment. So he says, I want to remind you of the gospel I preached, which you received and on which you have taken your stand. So they've already agreed to this. They've already said yes. They've already recognized that this is something that they want to build their lives on. And then Paul continues writing in verse 2. He says, by this gospel you are saved if you hold firmly to the word I preached to you. Okay, wait a second. So he's already preached the gospel to them, and now he says, listen, if you hold on to this truth that I preached to you, there's something good in it for you. There's something saving in it for you. Now, I grew up in the church. My dad's a Baptist pastor. He still is finishing out his last years of vocational ministry in Michigan, and I admire my dad a ton. But I grew up in the church, and I heard all sorts of stuff from all sorts of Christians all over the place about what saved means. And most of the time, what I heard was that the gospel means that I no longer have to be punished for my sin. And what we really reduce that to is to mean that I don't have to be in hell because of my sin. So I'd love for you to just read before what I read and after what I read and see if Paul ever says anything about any of that. He doesn't. There's no mention of hell. Now, I'll be forthright. I do believe there is a heaven, and I do believe there's a hell. I do believe there's an afterlife. I believe in all of that. But that's not what Paul is talking about right here. So when Paul says saved, he's not talking about saved from hell. He's talking about something that's happened now that they are already building their lives on that has impact in them now and will carry on for eternity. That's what Paul is talking about. There's this word saved is actually a very common word that Paul uses. It was used for being healed. It was used for rescuing somebody in a perilous situation. It was used in all sorts of ways. You could save an animal from being hunted down. That would be saving. All right? It was just as general of a term as you can possibly imagine. This is the word Paul uses. It's the word saved. And so Paul says, if you can grasp this good news about Jesus, there's this saving that's going to be happening in your life now. And we know from Paul's other writings that it's going to carry on into eternity. There's incredible impact if you pay attention to it. Verses 3 and 4, he continues writing, "For what I have received I pass on to you as of first importance." Okay, that's just a quick clue that Paul's not making something up. This is something that's been agreed on by all of the other followers of Jesus. Like, this is how they're going to state it. And then he gives us a really shorthand version. He gives us the smallest summary of the good news of Jesus that exists in Scripture. You can certainly expand it to much greater lengths, but this is about as short as it can get. He says, here's what I've received and I'm passing on to you, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures. Christ died. It's a real thing. It happened. There weren't a lot of people that were arguing that Jesus died. There were people that saw it. There's Roman records of it. There's nobody really that's arguing that Jesus died. But Paul adds in there that it's according to the Scriptures. Well, what is he talking about? Well, Paul is a Jewish person. He was raised in schools of Jewish thought. He was actually a really, really successful Jewish scholar. So successful that, by and large, the minimum education he would have had is he would have memorized the entire Old Testament. Now, the Bible's essentially broken up into two, we call them halves, but they're not really half. So here's the New Testament, okay, in my right hand. Here's the Old Testament. These are fine pages. Like, if you have ever picked up a Bible, you got to be gentle, right? I've opened up my bookmark in there and torn a page. That's how thin they are, because there's a lot of pages in there. Paul, at the very minor amount of his education, memorized that entirety right there. Now, I'll be honest, I struggled to memorize a few verses. It's not so tight up there, okay? But Paul, he memorized that whole thing. He knew his Scriptures, and that's what he's referring to. He's talking about all of this, that Christ dying is referenced in many small ways and some very significant ways here. Like, it was foretold. They were waiting for somebody who was going to die on behalf of Israel. Very few Jewish people around Paul in Jesus' time would have argued with that. They might have argued that Jesus wasn't the person it was referring to, but they would not have argued that somebody needed to die on behalf, or at the very least suffer on behalf of the people of God. Okay? So Paul references that. You can go back and check out some of those sources. Isaiah chapter 53, if you want to make a note of that. That's a really significant one of Jesus' suffering, or at least the Messiah's suffering. But so Paul says Jesus was crucified, and this was according to the Scriptures. He had to die. Now, that's the first part. The second part is that he was buried. And there's not a whole lot of note on this, but Paul includes that because there was a lot of schools of thought going on around the time that, okay, people understand you can die, okay? But was he really dead? Like, was he really dead, or did he just appear to be dead? Well, if you go back and read the account of Jesus, there's not many people who would argue that the type of suffering and the torture that Jesus went through, not to mention the hanging on the cross, like, if he wasn't dead, they didn't have to do anything to him. It was only a matter of time before he died. There was no coming back from that. But people knew that he was put into a tomb and it was sealed. And so I think Paul includes this little bit because it kind of puts to rest some of those arguments that maybe he wasn't actually dead. He's like, well, if he wasn't dead when they put him in the tomb, he died after he was in the tomb. Like, there was no coming back from that. Absolutely no coming back from that, but he was buried. Like, he didn't even have a chance to heal. He didn't have a chance to have access to any of the best medicines they had to offer. He was buried. Like, this is a matter of fact for Paul. He was crucified, he died, it was attested to in Scripture, and now he was buried. And then he includes the third thing, and here's the most outlandish thing. that on the third day he was raised according to the Scriptures. Again, Paul's referencing that bulk of the Scripture that has minor, nuanced thought towards not only will this chosen one, the Messiah, suffer, he's also going to be raised back up. He's going to be elevated. Paul says, listen, this was foretold. This was mentioned by our prophets. This was mentioned in our holy writings. And it's a huge thing that he was raised back to life. Now, here's where things start to fall apart. Not even all the Jewish people believed in a resurrection. They didn't believe it was going to happen. In fact, they thought if there was going to be a king that's rising up, he's not going to die. He's going to be successful. So Paul was writing about this in a different area, and he's like, this whole crucifixion thing, it's kind of a stumbling block to the Jews. They don't think it should happen. And then when we talk about it to the Romans and the Greeks, they're like, this is foolish. Like, I'm not sure why you're talking about this, but if you're trying to win us over, you might want a better selling point. And now he's saying that he's resurrected. Well, there's a whole group of people that's not even on the radar. We think that's weird, but guess what? They thought it was weird too. Death, burial, we get that. Resurrection? At best, they believed in some of their mythology that people were resurrected, but into like this disembodied ghostly form. They had great belief in ghosts and afterlife, but somebody being risen from the dead, they were raised back to life, well, that's crazy. That's a little bit off the wall. And Paul includes that in his summary because it's one of the single most important points of his good news. In fact, if we go back to verse 2, we realize he says this, otherwise you have believed in vain. Like if you don't hold fast to the truth, if you don't build and hold on to what I'm talking about in this summary of the gospel, including the resurrection, then you have to understand something about what you believe. It's pointless. It's absolutely pointless. In fact, if we go to verse 17, we're going to have that up on the slide as well. We're not reading all the way through here, but verse 17 says this, and if Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. Like this isn't a section where Paul goes and he slows down and he says like there's a whole bunch of important stuff about the life of Jesus, but I want to slow down and talk about the resurrection because everybody's going to die. Everybody's going to be buried. But here's the unique, crazy thing that we believe, that somebody died who shouldn't have died. He died for us, but he didn't stay dead. He was legitimately dead. He was in the ground. He was buried. But he didn't stay that way. And if this isn't true, then nothing we believe matters. Not a single thing we believe. And now we could bring this all the way forward to us today. If the resurrection did not happen, you're wasting your time in this room right now. I promise you. I'm wasting my time up here. In fact, I'll have wasted my entire life. If the resurrection isn't true, then none of this Jesus stuff matters. If the resurrection isn't true, Jesus was a shyster and a con man. But if the resurrection is true, then everything Jesus said, everything he did, and everything that Paul is writing, not just to the church of Corinth, but that we have to learn from now, it all matters a great deal. It'll become the single most important event in all of history. Without it, the sacrifice of Jesus means absolutely nothing. He's just a dead man. Without it, every bit of theology, every bit of doctrine, every bit of morality that has ever been taught in the church for ages and ages and ages is all wasted. This is the single most defining event in all of history. Because if it's true, just think about the implications. No matter what you agree with right now or disagree with, just think about the implications. I don't care if you saw really good examples of Christianity or really bad examples of Christianity. Think about the implications of a resurrection of Jesus. It matters. It matters a great deal. That's why Paul is talking about it. He's talking about the resurrection because he believes something. He believes that this church of Corinth shouldn't just accept Jesus intellectually, but that they should build their lives on the truth of the resurrection. that it has implications for them as well. And I think some of them were having a hard time with it intellectually. So Paul says, listen, I really, really, really want you to believe in the resurrection. And so I'm going to give you a few reasons you should agree with the resurrection. That's why he continues on writing. He says, after he was raised on the third day, according to the scriptures, we get to verse 5, and he appeared to Cephas and then to the 12. Now, Cephas was one of Jesus' closest followers. You might know him by the name Peter. I think Paul's taking a shot here at Peter, and I'll tell you why. Peter's original name was Cephas. It wasn't until he had followed Jesus for a little while that he was known as Peter. It was after he made a confession about who Jesus was. And Jesus says, you're Peter, which sounds like the word rock. He's like, you're a rock. You're solid as a rock. But if you know Peter's story, or if you don't know Peter's story, here's how it goes. Peter follows Jesus, and then Jesus gets arrested. Peter's pretty bold in a lot of the words he says, and Jesus even says, listen, I'm going to be betrayed, and you're all going to follow away on account of me. And Peter looks at him and he says, I'm never going to follow away. I'll never deny you. Well, who's the first person that denies Jesus? Peter. He's a little less rocky, a little more waffly at this point. And so I think, truthfully, this is just my opinion, I think Peter's taking a shot at him. He's like, you're not a rock. You're a Cephas. Like you weren't a rock on which Jesus could build. You denied Jesus. You went all the way back to pre-Peter. You're Cephas. Now, he could be taking a shot, and I think he might be a little bit in jest because they had a relationship, right? They were friends, sort of. Frenemies maybe might be more the appropriate word. But sometimes they got along, sometimes they didn't get along. So I think he's taking a shot, but I also think he's pointing out something about Peter's own story. I think Peter needed a resurrection himself. I think Peter needed a resurrection, and so Paul uses his original name to say, you guys know him as Peter, but he was once Cephas, then he became Peter, and then he was Cephas, but after the resurrection, he was Peter again. And we just read the resurrection story too, so what's interesting is the first person that Jesus appeared to in his resurrected form wasn't even Peter, or like Cephas, Peter, whatever you want to call him. It was actually Mary. So why doesn't Paul point out Mary? Well, he's not trying to minimize women. What he's trying to do is point out the significance of Peter's belief. Like, you got a guy who left everything to follow Jesus. He denied him, and now he's leading the church in Jerusalem? Why? How? Why would you follow that guy? Honestly, none of you seeing Peter deny Jesus would be like, that's the dude I need to follow. You'd think, I'm going to find anybody but that guy. Maybe somebody who didn't really deny Jesus, but they also didn't say they weren't going to deny Jesus either. Let's just follow anybody else. There's a pretty good group to choose from. It's the resurrection. It's the resurrection. So Paul's reason one is look at Cephas. Peter. Look at Peter. He experienced, not only saw the resurrection of Jesus, but he experienced this resurrection of Jesus. Then he says to the 12, and even though if you go back and read the story, not all 12 were there when Jesus appeared to him the first time, but it's just kind of this terminology that's used for that group of individuals, whether they were all there or not. The 12, that's Jesus' closest followers. After that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Now, why does Paul say that? He goes through all this list. He's like, there's Cephas, there's the 12. You can go talk to them. Then there's over 500 other people that saw Jesus resurrected. So if you don't believe me, Paul says, about the resurrection, why don't you go talk to them? In fact, most of them are still alive. Now, I don't know if you've ever followed any of the big court cases ever. If you ever watch those things, witnesses, interviewing witnesses is a big deal. And what they're trying to do is they're trying to find under oath what happened at that time. What actually happened. There might be nuances. Somebody might have seen something from a different perspective, but at the heart of it, they're looking for the same story. And the moment there's inconsistency, then the credibility of those witnesses falls apart. And what they would hope for in a court of law is at least two witnesses that are really together and can be found as truthful. If you could have two or maybe even three witnesses, that's a beautiful thing. Paul's like, I got this. Talk to Peter, talk to the 12, talk to the 500. Most of them are still alive. You can go talk to them yourself and see if they're still holding on to this reality. Now, Charles Colson was one of Richard Nixon, former President Richard Nixon's closest guys. Now, it might be kind of cool for some people, but when you're involved in the Watergate scandal, along with Nixon, might not be such a cool thing. In fact, Charles Colson was one of the guys that also took a fall along with the other people in the Watergate scandal, and he did time for his crime. It was in prison that he found Jesus, or rather Jesus found him, and he put his trust in Jesus. And he ended up becoming a really big proponent for Christianity, for following Jesus. And he brought his own experience forward into other reasons why maybe we should pay attention to what Paul is writing here. Charles Colson says this, good old Chuck. I know the resurrection is a fact, and Watergate proved it to me. How? Because 12 men, and from Paul's perspective, over 500 men and women beyond that, because 12 men testified that they had seen Jesus risen from the dead, and they proclaimed the truth for 40 years, never once denying it. Everyone was beaten, tortured, stoned, and put in prison. What Colson leaves out is most of them were murdered or martyred for their belief as well. They would not have endured it if that weren't true. Watergate embroiled 12 of the most powerful men in the world, and they couldn't keep alive for 3 weeks. You're telling me 12 apostles could keep alive for 40 years? Absolutely impossible. I've heard it said, like, this is just, like, this whole thing is just something that Jesus' followers made up. I promise you, there's not a lie I've ever told that I'm like, yeah, kill me for this. See what's up. I'm not folding. I didn't take the extra cookie. I'm not taking a fall like that for that. These guys were beaten, tortured, stoned, put in prison, and tradition, at least for the 12 closest apostles for Jesus, they were all killed for their faith, except for John. They boiled him, but he didn't die, and he wouldn't shut up, so they put him on an island until he died. Okay? That's the end result. I don't think there were many people that were like, hey, that sounds like a pretty good retirement plan. Sign me up. I would fold like a cheap suit, I promise you. I think most of us, if we knew something wasn't true, if we had taken the body, I'm like, here, let me give you the coordinates. I got GPS. There's like a little geo, it's there. It's over there. It's buried. You'll find it easily. Just take a couple sniffer dogs. You'll find it. I would not hold on to that if it was a lie. We're not very good at it. I appreciate Colson's honesty. He's like, listen, if you can have this many witnesses and they can take it to the grave, maybe it deserves to be listened to. Maybe there's some credibility in it. But Paul continues on. He doesn't stop with the over 500. He says, then he appeared to James. Now, we believe this is James, the brother of Jesus. Okay, we talked a little bit about this last week, but James, the brother of Jesus, Paul puts him in there because James was not a big fan of his brother. For the whole course of Jesus' life and his public ministry, James did not believe his brother was who he said he was, right? And you can't blame him. You can't fault him for that. You have to look at the regular dynamics of having a sibling. You would never believe that about your sibling. But Jesus apparently appeared to James, and I have to believe that when Jesus appeared to James, he probably grabbed him by the shoulders. I'm imagining James is probably tear-filled in his eyes. And I think Jesus looked deep into his eyes and was like, I told you. I told you. And that was James's conversion point. He's like, okay, you win, man. Mom was right. You are the favorite. You win. And James became a follower of Jesus. And so people could go back and be like, James, did you really not believe that Jesus was who he said? No, I didn't. What made you believe? He showed up after he was supposed to be dead. That's a pretty convincing argument. And then Paul ends with himself. He ends with who he is. He says, last of all, he appeared to me also as one abnormally born. Now, he goes and gives a little summary after that, but you have to understand that Paul wasn't always Paul. He was Saul, and as Saul, he was a leader in the Jewish synagogues, and he had authorized letters to imprison anybody who was following Jesus. He wanted to do the most he could legally. He wasn't Roman authority, so he couldn't kill anybody, but he was going to do everything he could short of killing them. And if he could find a way to condemn them and have them put to death by Rome, like they did with Jesus, that would be pretty cool too. And he went all around. His goal was to stamp out this newly formed cult around Jesus. He's going to end it. And then Jesus showed up to him. And seeing the resurrected Jesus for Saul was the single most defining point of his entire life. It didn't matter what his education was. It didn't matter how much status he had. It didn't matter what anything else had happened up to that point. He was now going to live in light of the resurrection, so much so that it was like a rebirth. That's why he says, as to one abnormally born. Everybody else followed Jesus. There's a whole group of people that were just listed, other than James, like the 12 and the 500. They had come regularly. They really liked what Jesus had to say. Paul did not like what Jesus had to say. Paul knew that Jesus had died. He knew all of the rest of the stuff. The only thing that changed his mind was the resurrected Jesus. And Paul says, listen, you can go talk to all of these people, and you're going to understand something. We have to understand something about the resurrection as well, something about Jesus. It's this: the resurrection validates the truth of Jesus. The resurrection, it validates the truth of Jesus. You can know everything you want to about Jesus, but without the resurrection, it doesn't matter. That's why it's such a significant moment for us as a group of followers. That's why it could be a significant moment for you, no matter where your belief system is. It validates the truth about Jesus. Think of the implications if all of this is true. What if Jesus is who he says he is? I've heard some people say, well, couldn't Jesus just be like a really good moral teacher? I really like the teachings of Jesus. Seemed like he was pretty nice. Seems like he even threw some pretty good ragers. But why couldn't he just be a good teacher? I appreciate what C.S. Lewis wrote. I don't know if you know C.S. Lewis. He wrote some pretty cool books a lot of people like. But he also wasn't a believer his whole life. There was a moment when the resurrection became real for him, and he was very intellectual, and so he thought through a lot of stuff. And it's not going to be on the screen, but I just want to read it to you, so you can just take this in. It's way too long to put up on the screen. He says this: a man who was merely a man and said the same sort of things Jesus said would not be a great moral teacher. He would either be a lunatic on the level with the man who says he is a poached egg, or else he would be the devil of hell. You must make your choice. Either this man was and is the Son of God, or else a madman or something worse. You can shut him up for a fool, you can spit at him and kill him as a demon, or you can fall at his feet and call him Lord and God. But let us not come with any patronizing nonsense about his being a great human teacher. He has not left that open to us. He did not intend to. Now it seems to me obvious that he was neither a lunatic nor a fiend, and consequently, however strange or terrifying or unlikely it may seem, I have to accept the view that he was and is God. This is the journey I'm inviting all of us into. I think maybe this morning you could be like one of the Greeks or the Romans. This just seems like foolishness. It seems like madness. Maybe you're even like those in the church of Corinth, that you've received it, but it hasn't had many implications on your life yet. I think we're all in the same boat, that we have to reconsider fresh and new what has happened and live in light of a new event that I believe if we can hold on to it and we can receive it, it has the power to shift, redefine, redeem, and restore every other event of our lives. That's the invitation from Jesus too. Not that you become perfect. I'm far from perfect. Talk to my family. They'll admit it. Like, they have no problems saying it. I'm far from perfect. But I know you are too. We're all in the same boat. We all need resurrection. We all need the truth of resurrection. We all need to live in light of a different, more powerful event. And I believe it's this event that validates the truth of everything Jesus said he is. I'm not asking you to receive the entirety of this. I don't care if you don't believe all of this right now. I don't. You might hate some of it. You might see it as really weird or confusing or just not able to be trusted. All I'm asking you to do today is to consider trusting one singular event, and it's the resurrection. If you can accept that, then it has to validate everything Jesus said is true. So just go to Jesus for right now. That's it. I'm not asking you to agree with me on everything else. I'm just asking you to consider that what if this resurrection thing is true? I want to give you a few reasons. This is really just kind of summing up a lot of the reasons I've already given you, but I want to give you a few reasons that you really should believe in the resurrection. The first one is the witnesses. We've already talked about that from Scripture. Right? If somebody like Paul and James can change everything based on one singular event, I think that's pretty trustworthy. The fact that Paul would say, go talk to the people yourself. Don't take my word for it. I'm just passing on what I heard. You go talk to them yourself. They'll tell you. See if there's a single one of them that denies that the resurrection of Jesus is true. He showed up to all of them. But here's another reason that I think we need to take, another thing I think we need to take into account is all over the world, there's massive reports of people in all sorts of areas of the world where it's dangerous, it's physically dangerous to believe in Christianity, and Jesus is still showing up to them in visions, dreams, and in bodily form. So either there's a whole lot of people who are still perpetuating a lie and willing to leave their families before they're put to death, and that seems worth it to them, or we have to start paying attention to the witnesses. If there were this many witnesses continually, not just at that time, but even now, of the resurrection of Jesus, if there were that many witnesses brought into a courtroom, they would just close the case. They'd be like, this is done deal. You're guilty or you're innocent or whatever the case may be. This would be a done deal. There are stories all over the world of Jesus still showing up to people because it's too dangerous even to talk about him, so he has to appear himself. A few weeks ago, we heard from Jaskrin. He and Tracy aren't here, but if you've never met Jaskrin, he's a pastor in India, and they've been with us. They're going to be with us for a couple more months. And his family has come to Jesus because he came to Jesus, and then he prayed really hard that his family would, and Jesus showed up to his family. His dad was like an elder in the Sikh temple locally, and now he's on fire, and he's like, you better believe in Jesus. He's one of the biggest proponents. He's one of the biggest salesmen for Jesus because Jesus showed up to him. Believe the witnesses. Secondly, I want to give you another reason, and this is maybe a bit of an assumption, but I think everybody longs for resurrection. I think you do. No matter what you believe about Jesus, no matter what you believe about the Bible or Christianity or what you believe about me, I think you long for resurrection. Maybe you're like Peter, where you realize that there's a whole lot of events you've been living in light of, and you wish that maybe you couldn't go back and change those things, but you wish you could be free of some of the elements of them. There's something in the resurrection for you as well. I think at some level we all long for it. There's something in us that wants to be restored. There's something in us that wants to be freer. We'd love to be able to live in light of a different, more powerful truth. Professor and scholar D.A. Carson says this: you are not suffering from anything that a good resurrection can't fix. It's true. There's no brokenness in your relationships, past, present, or future, that can't be fixed by resurrection. The truth of Jesus' resurrection. That's why Paul emphasizes it. It's the most important part of the gospel. He didn't stay dead. He was raised to new life, not just to be a sacrifice for you, but to show you how you can live a resurrected life. Not in a moralistic way, but in a freedom way of being free from all those past things. Jesus' ministry was about healing and restoring, and the resurrection is validity that those things can still happen for you. I think there's something in you that wants bits of your past or your story healed, restored, and redeemed. I know I do. Now, I haven't seen Jesus myself, not with my eyes, but I've seen his resurrection life in my own story. I've yearned for it and I've hungered for it, and I believe all of us do, and I am proof myself that you can experience it. There's one more reason I think you should believe in the resurrection. Simply this: what do you have to lose? If at the end of my life I'm wrong, okay? If at the end of my life I'm wrong and I really have wasted my time in my career, then the worst case scenario, this is what I truly believe. I've been a better father because of it. I've been a better husband because of it. And I've been a better friend because of it. If that's worst case scenario, I'm still happy I did it. What do you have to lose? Statistically even, don't even just take my word for it. There was a Gallup poll in 2022 that showed a significant correlation between mental health and religious involvement. Now, this goes a little bit beyond Christianity as well, but researchers at Mayo Clinic are quoted saying, most studies have shown that religious involvement and spirituality are associated with better health outcomes, including greater longevity, coping skills, and health-related quality of life, even during terminal illness, less anxiety, depression, and suicide. Several studies have even shown that addressing the spiritual needs of the patient may enhance recovery from illness. What do you have to lose? I'd encourage you that if you're on that edge of skepticism today, just give it a try. You don't even have to tell me you agree. You don't even have to talk to me. What I would say is just start opening the Bible maybe in Matthew or Mark, those Luke and John, those are the biographies of Jesus. Start reading about the things that he said. Start looking at the things that he does, and maybe just start mimicking it for a couple of months and see what changes. See what changes. If nothing changes, I'll give you your money back. But I believe something will change. I think you'll start to taste a little bit of resurrection. I think you will. It doesn't mean life's going to be perfect. There's going to be people around you that still hurt you. There's going to be people in here that might still hurt you. Because the goal is not that you look at us as Jesus, but you look at Jesus as Jesus. We're all trying to experience resurrection together. So if somebody has hurt you and they claim to be a Christian, well, they weren't Jesus to begin with. Look at Jesus. I don't know anybody that claims to be perfect, but I do know everybody that I know in my life longs for the resurrection. And I believe everybody has something only to gain from believing it is true. I want to invite the worship team back up this morning. I want to pray. I want to pray, and I want to pray in a special way. I think there's a couple of things that we need to pray for this morning. I want to give you a chance that if you are on that in that place right now where you're like, yeah, I'm ready to say yes to Jesus. Like, I don't know if I can say yes to everything, but I'm saying yes to experiencing resurrection today. I want that. I want to give you a chance to do that. Maybe that's saying yes for the first time. Maybe you're sitting here and you've sat here for a long time and you've professed to follow Jesus, but you're like, you know what? I'm coming back for the first time, and I need to say yes to that resurrection again. I want to invite you to do it as well. I want you to say, maybe not for the first time, but maybe for the second or maybe even fifth time, I want you to say yes to the resurrection, to welcoming new life back into your life. Let's pray.